Live.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sydney Dominguez, and I'm the former president of the George Mason University Antonin Scalia Law School's Federalist Society chapter. Happy May the 4th. I'll be introducing our panelists today for our event, FEDDIE Wars, Attack of the Clones on the Legitimacy of Cloning. First of all, I'd like to introduce Ashley Baker. Ashley is the Director of Public Policy at the Committee for Justice. Her focus areas include the Supreme Court, regulatory policy, antitrust, and judicial nominations. Her writing has frequently appeared on Fox News, USA Today, the Boston Globe, Law 360, and many other publications. She has testified before the United States Senate on the topic of antitrust law as well. Ashley is also the founder of the Alliance on Antitrust, which is a coalition of more than 24 conservative organizations and individuals defending the consumer welfare standard and the rule of law while fostering greater understanding of the issues and arguments at the core of antitrust debates. Ashley is an active member of the Federalist Society, where she serves as a member of both the Regulatory Transparency Project's Antitrust and Consumer Protection and Cyber and Security Working Groups, and as a member of the Republican National Lawyers Association. She has served as a speaker on the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. Ashley also serves as an official observer on the Uniform Law Commission's drafting committee on the collection and use of personally identifiable data. Next, I'd like to introduce our panelist, Daniel Suhr. Daniel Suhr serves as the managing attorney at the Liberty Justice Center, where he spends every day on the front lines of the fight to preserve our rights and liberties. With his colleagues, Daniel spearheads LJC's education reform practice, arguing against the ACLU to save scholarships for low-income parents in Tennessee and demanding that bureaucrats in Arizona do right by children with special needs and military families. Before joining LJC, he served as a policy director for Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, where he helped advance the Badger State's goal of statewide school choice. Daniel is pursuing a number of precedent-setting cases to establish the full rights of public sector workers identified in the landmark Janus case. And this fits well with his previous work as deputy legal counsel for Governor Walker, where he was among the attorneys defending Wisconsin's groundbreaking Act 10 reforms to public sector collective bargaining. Prior to working for Governor Walker, Daniel clerked for Judge Diane Sykes of the United States Court of Appeals for the 7th Circuit. Daniel holds a BA and a JD from Marquette University and master's degrees from Georgetown University Law Center and the University of Missouri-Columbia. And lastly, but definitely not least, I would like to introduce Professor Adam Mossoff. Professor Mossoff is a professor at George Mason Antonin Scalia Law School. He has published extensively on why patents, copyrights, and other intellectual property rights have been and should be legally secured to innovators and creators as property rights. His scholarship has been relied on by the United States Supreme Court, by lower federal courts, and by U.S. federal agencies. He has been invited to testify numerous times before the United States Senate and the House of Representatives on intellectual property legislation. His writings on intellectual property policy have also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Forbes, Investors Business Daily, and in other media outlets. Professor Mossoff is a longstanding member of the Executive Committee of the Intellectual Property Practice Group of the Federalist Society, on which he served as chairperson from 2016 to 2018. He is chair of the Intellectual Property Working Group of the Regulatory Transparency Project of the Federalist Society. He is senior fellow and chair of the Forum for Intellectual Property at the Hudson Institute, a visiting intellectual property fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and a member of the board of directors of the Center for Intellectual Property Understanding. He is a member of the Intellectual Property Rights Policy Committee of ANSI, and he has served as chair and vice chair of the Intellectual Property Committee of the IEEE-USA, on which he remains a member of good standing. Please join me in thanking all of our speakers tonight.
May the 4th be with you. Welcome, Gungans and Droids, Jaws and Twi'leks, and all citizens of the New Republic throughout the galaxy to our second annual FEDDIE Fight Night debate between the light side and the dark side. As always, the Federalist Society serves as a platform for a robust change of viewpoints from everyone in the marketplace of ideas. I'm Ashley Ackbar, formerly the leader of the Rebel Fleet, and now the full Admiral of the Grand Fleet of the New Republic. I'm the Galactic Arbiter for tonight's debate between Jedi Master Obi Dan Suhr and Grand Admiral Mossoff of the 8th Galactic Fleet. The topic of our debate tonight is on the legitimacy of cloning. Is this a technology that conflicts with the life-affirming nature of the Force, merely serving to create multiple Emperor Palpatines who continue to torment the good citizens of the galaxy with his Sith followers? Or is this a technology that advances the quality and quantity of human life, making possible life that was once snuffled out by the dark side forces, like diseases that have become the scourge of humanity for thousands of years? Is cloning a new hope, or is it a phantom menace? As Master Suhr and Admiral Mossoff duel with each other, we'll follow traditional FEDSOC debate format, with each giving opening statements of 10 to 12 minutes. They each will have the opportunity to respond briefly to each other's remarks, and then I will interrogate them further along with the audience that has been able to join us, of course, from around the galaxy, all of you, via this incredible technology called Zoom, which will also allow you to raise your hand or preferably use the Q&A function to ask a question. So in our prior discussion of logistics, Admiral Mossoff volunteered to go first, and he will be defending cloning technology. Despite my warning to Master Suhr that it's a trap, he consented to the order of opening arguments, and he'll be critiquing cloning technology. Admiral Mossoff, may the 4th be with you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Admiral Baker. And I must first point out that I will neither offer nor accept any May the 4th acclamations. May the 4th is a rebel holiday. As an admiral in the Imperial fleet, I celebrate only one holiday this month, Revenge of the 5th, tomorrow. Now, in my opening remarks, I will briefly set forth some of the foundational issues for Master Jedi Suhr and me to have a robust discussion between ourselves and ultimately with Admiral Ashley Baker and our audience. Now, of course, I'm actually delighted that Master Suhr has chosen to debate this topic with me, if only because my own clone, Darth Maul Mossoff, crushed him last year in the debate over the political legitimacy of the Empire. And thus today, with the full might of the Empire and the full power of the 8th Imperial Fleet directly under my command, I expect to repeat tonight what was my Sith clone success last year. Now, as stated, I am defending biotech generally and cloning specifically as an unalloyed good. Now, not just a good for humans, for all living beings, Wookiees, Twi'leks, Mandalorians, Jawas, and I shudder to even say this, even for Gungans like Jar Jar Binks. So if anything, my willingness to defend Jar Jar Binks benefiting from cloning technology is proof of my commitment to this normative principle. Now, at the outset, I want to make clear I do not agree with the conventional wisdom that technology is neutral, whether cloning or some other biotechnology or mechanical technology. Now, it's very common to hear this today. Technology is neutral and it can be used for good or bad, right? So for example, the technology in converting a kyber crystal into a usable power beam. Well, it's neither good nor bad. Good would be perhaps a lightsaber used by Jedi Master Suhr, or bad, the Death Star, right? But by the way, I'll point out that even lightsabers are not purely good, right? Emperor Palpatine, also known as Darth Sidious, and other Sith Lords like Darth Vader and Darth Maul and others use lightsabers for purposes that I don't think anyone would normally define as good. But nonetheless, this is typically the framing. My position is, in fact, that technology is good, and the application of biotechnology to medical care, biotechnology, like cloning, is even better. The biotech revolution has made our quality of life today a miracle by any historical standard. The healthcare death sentences of yesteryear are now manageable conditions today, whether we're talking about cancer, diabetes, hepatitis, and even common staph infections that killed untold numbers of people indiscriminately for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, we often forget it was less than 100 years ago, just in 1924, that President Coolidge's 16-year-old son died from a staph infection within 1 week because he injured his little toe playing tennis on the White House lawn. There were no antibiotics yet to treat what is a very common infection that we now simply buy cream from over the counter at CVS or Walgreens. Now, this insight also applies to cloning. Now, cloning doesn't necessarily mean and shouldn't mean a massive army at the disposal of Chancellor Palpatine who will use it to commit mass murder in Order 66. Cloning also doesn't mean recreating new people like the reborn Emperor Palpatine who sought to establish the new order of another galactic empire, No, cloning is good because it represents a medical technology that makes possible the identification and treatment of diseases and other maladies that afflict humans and prevent us from living long and flourishing lives. Now, why is technology good, and how is biotechnology of cloning an application of this principle? And that's going to be the rest of the substance of my opening remarks. So first, I'm going to explain the general principle, the normative claim that that technology is good. And once that framework is established, I can then explain and justify the specific application of that framework in the context of biotechnology like cloning. Now, first then, why is technology good? Why, or more precisely, why is technology an unmitigated good? Well, the easy answer for originalists is perhaps, well, the Constitution empowers Congress in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, to, quote, promote the progress of the useful arts, unquote, by enacting patent laws, right? And in fact, the first Congress very quickly enacted the very first Patent Act. The Patent Act of 1790 was one of the very first pieces of legislation. They spent weeks debating what to call President Washington. They immediately enacted the Patent Act because they understood that there had to be a legal platform to secure reliable and effective property rights in the new innovations that would ultimately drive the US innovation economy and sustain a flourishing society, which has in fact occurred both through the Industrial Revolution and then the computer revolution, and then in the biotech revolution today. But let's look deeper at the philosophical principle this innovative constitutional clause that was created by the founders represents. Now, the underlying philosophical principle, of course, is humans are unique. Now, I don't mean that we're unique because we're the only species along with one Wookiee that happened to make the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs. No, nor are we unique because we're the only species that was somehow able to make 2 torpedoes turn at right angles into an exhaust port to blow up the Death Star, right? We all know now, by the way, that Luke was not good at bullseyeing womp rats in his T-16. They had nothing to do with ordinary skill. Jedis always are using the Force to cheat. Just ask Master Suhr. So humans are unique, not because of those aspects of our experiences, but instead because unlike other animals, we have to use our minds to conceive of and then guide our productive activities to create the tools, devices, and other methods and objects necessary to live. Now, this isn't a modern insight. Aristotle identified thousands of years ago that man is a rational animal. John Locke himself also recognized the key role of the human mind in developing the virtues necessary for a flourishing life, and the key role of productive labor in sustaining this flourishing life by producing values to sustain human life. And even contemporary philosopher Ayn Rand made this an explicit philosophical principle in her philosophy. That the theme of her magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged, is that man's mind is his basic means of survival. Thus, technology, broadly defined as all the invented methods and products that we use throughout all aspects of our life to live, is what humans create, not just to sustain our lives physically, but ultimately to live flourishing lives. In the 19th century, it's included railroads, and engines, and light bulbs. In the 20th century, airplanes and electrical power systems, computers, modern medicine. The 21st century, mobile computing devices, biotech, and even mRNA vaccines. And eventually, it'll include things like spaceships like the Millennium Falcon, hyperspace technology, hopefully, land speeders, and even a Bacta tank, right, which helped Luke, and now we know even a reformed Boba Fett to bring law and order back to Tatooine. Now contrast this with things like the murder bears. The Ewoks, who did not really create anything to sustain either human or alien life throughout the galaxy. No, it was the innovators and creators using their minds and working with others to mass produce the goods and services that advance human life that we can thank for the quality and quantity of our lives, right? It was innovators creating technologies that made it possible for even grumpy old Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru to live comfortably well on a barren desert world, drinking that delicious blue milk that was kept cold in a fridge that was kept cold by power from generators, more technology, generators sustained by Luke doing his chores and picking up some power converters from the Tashi station, right? So, oh, by the way, as an aside, the milk, that blue milk really is quite tasty. They sell it at Galaxy's Edge, and I highly recommend that you buy some when you visit, which everyone should do. So in this fundamental sense, technology, especially biotechnology like Bacta tanks and cloning, are good. But what is it about cloning that represents this key insight that technology is the physical manifestation of how humans use their minds to live flourishing lives? Now, Cloning is the biotech innovation that makes it possible for us to recreate living tissue, right? Now recall, in fact, now the first reference to Darth Vader in Star Wars. Obi-Wan Kenobi, a fellow Jedi extremist, along with Master Suhr, tells young Luke that Darth Vader is more machine than human, right? In fact, we later learn as Anakin Skywalker kept acting brashly and he kept losing limbs, like his right arm to Count Dooku's lightsaber. And what is his arm replaced with? A robotic prothesis, right? And just as Luke's right hand is later replaced by another robotic prothesis after Anakin, whom Vader, cuts it off. Now, wouldn't it have been immeasurably better for Anakin if they could have simply cloned him a new arm and a back to tank? Anakin would have retained the connection to his humanity, his living tissue, that would have countered his continued embrace of anger and his alienation of life through machine living. Cloning could have made that possible. But then again, then we wouldn't have had 6 more movies. Back on Earth, early forms of cloning technology has already made possible the vast array of medical diagnostic tests that doctors use to quickly identify all sorts of ailments, from strep throat to COVID-19 to cancer. It's a technology that was represented at the birth of the biotech revolution in the 1960s. This technology is called monoclonal antibodies that are produced by genetically engineered hybridoma, and where they can reproduce and clone these antibodies and then test to see if you have the antigen, the virus or the cancer that attaches to those things. That's what creates the little blue strip in your testing devices. By the way, these innovations involving monoclonal antibodies were some of the key patents that drove the massive investments in new biotech startups that led to the biotech explosion itself that began in the 1980s. And this biotech revolution is responsible for untold millions of lives today globally who are not just alive, but are living better and longer lives too. Now, this isn't, a new phenomenon. We shouldn't think that this is simply a modern phenomenon. Even before the biotech revolution, humans have been cloning plants and animals for thousands of years. All food and domestic animals today are genetically modified organisms through long processes of selective breeding, which is simply a longer form process of what scientists achieve through slicing and dicing DNA and recreating it in the lab. So when we create the same animal again and again and again with the same traits, that's cloning in its most basic generic form. Whether it's my beagles, Edison and Tesla, whether it's an ear of corn or a stalk of wheat, or whether it's a cow that we use to make delicious steak. Now, the biotech revolution just kicked this off into hyperdrive. And the result has been an equally immeasurable expansion in the quality and quantity of our lives today. And thankfully, the biotech sector wasn't running on the Millennium Falcon with its continually faulty hyperdrive. It ran on the reliable and effective foundation of the patent system. Now, that's my opening remarks that I think that'll help frame how I'm going to approach this issue. And with the support of this opening statement, Admiral Baker, I now yield the virtual Zoom floor to Jedi Suhr, whom I'm certain will continue to use his Jedi mind tricks to try to convince us that these are not the clones we are in fact looking for.
Well, thank you, Admiral, and good evening from the Mace Windu Memorial Center for Galactic Ethics. Here at the Windu Center, we honor the legacy of the great Jedi Master Mace Windu, a martyr for Republican virtue, really a Cato or Cicero of the galaxy, struck down in the defense of democracy. Of course, we call it the Windu Memorial Center because he is no longer with us in the flesh. And unlike some people, we don't think it's right to clone dead people. Better to let them be at peace and become one with the Force and only show up in fuzzy blue Force form at crucial plot points when we need their advice and encouragement. So, as much as I respect the gentleman in blue face, which is perhaps more of a problem for his becoming governor of Virginia someday than wearing blackface, I dissent from his enthusiasm for breeding babies for war. Rather, much like Mitt Romney once said of corporations, clones are people too, and they deserve to be treated as such. But because that has proven impossible, I wish the galaxy had never gone down this road in the first place. Consider, clones have individual names and personalities. Who cannot help recall the lovable Commander Rex, the loyal Commander Cody, the adorable Omega, the sympathetic Fives, or the badass Boba Fett? Though the white armor masks much, and though the second and third prequel movies suggest clones are basically interchangeable, mindless automatons, the subsequent TV shows have shown clones to be interesting, introspective, and individual. They develop bonds with their Jedi generals. Think of the touching moments of Rex and Ashoka Tano together after Order 66, or the opening episode of The Bad Batch, when the team decides to allow a young Padawan named Kanan Jarrus to escape and survive. Clones can have families and hobbies. In the Clone Wars and The Bad Batch, we meet Cut LaQuain, the rare clone army deserter who becomes a family man farmer on the outer rim planet of Selukami. In Rebels, we find that lovable Commander Rex living his best life as a retired veteran, hanging out with his wartime buddies in what's basically a mobile American Legion post. Perhaps the most famous child of a clone is none other than Rey Skywalker, whose father is a clone of Emperor Palpatine. In the book Skywalker, A Family at War, we learn that the clone was created on the dark world of Exegol to function as a host body for Sidious's spirit. And we all know how well host bodies for Dark Lords turn out. Due to his lack of Force abilities, the clone was rejected as a failure, but later escaped and fathered a daughter, Rey, continuing the Palpatine bloodline. And they lived a peaceful family existence on Jakku as junk traders until the Sith minions tracked them down and they had to hide Rey. Perhaps most importantly, though Rey's father did not have Force abilities, other clones definitely do. Who can forget the Thrawn trilogy's evil Joruus C'baoth, Jedi clone of Joruus Windu C'baoth, or Luke Skywalker, cloned from the original Skywalker's severed hand. And Sith Queltus on Exegol made other clones to keep Palpatine's spirit alive, including the Force-sensitive Supreme Leader Snoke, and the Palpatine we see at the end of The Rise of Skywalker in the weird body harness thing. I just ask you, can anyone look at this picture and think this is a good idea? Yoda tells his 3 clone bodyguards at the very end of the very first episode of the Clone Wars, in the Force, very different each of you are. Yes, clones you may be, but the Force resides in all life forms. Use it, you can, to quiet your mind. So, we know that clones are people with personalities and names and families and minds, each unique and endowed with midichlorians. But they're not treated like people. They're used as human fuel to keep the fires of war burning bright across the galaxy. Consider, clones have no legal rights or recognition of their inherent humanity. Clones bred on Kamino are child soldiers, as bad as anything you would find in the Congo or the Sudan. Who can forget the younglings shown to Master Obi-Wan sitting on screens? I say again to all the parents, going to school virtually on screens, learning to fight when they should be outside, frolicking through fields of flowers with females, like other youths of their age. And once they are adults, they are sent off to war with no right to choose, no patriotic response to the responsibilities of citizenship, nothing but a duty to fight and die. War for them is hardly a call to defend hearth and home, field and family, when you have no home but a bunk on a Star Destroyer, and no family but a million identical twin brothers. Clones are controllable objects of policy, denied any free will. Their biochip implants cause them to obey Order 66 and gun down the Jedi generals that they've loyally been serving. They're deployed and destroyed at the whim of the Emperor. The clones who can't be controlled are named the Bad Batch and are ruthlessly hunted down for exercising a little judgment about shooting a force-sensitive teenager in the back. As one of the Camino cloners explains in episode 2, you'll find they are totally obedient, taking any order without question. We modified their genetic structure to make them less independent than the original hosts. Yet at the same time, the cloner explains, clones can think creatively. You'll find they are immensely superior to droids. And what are battle droids? Derided as clankers. They are cannon fodder, and often slapstick comedy fodder of the Jar Jar Binks variety. This is not a compliment. The fact that the entire premise of the Clone Wars, and to a lesser extent, the third movie, is to set clone soldiers up as expendable opposites of an expendable droid army, which shows just how dehumanized they have become. To channel Anthony Kennedy, this is a dignity harm par excellence. In fact, the treatment of clones as cannon fodder just encourages war. When a civilian population has to bear the burdens of war, for instance, through conscription or a draft, it insists that its political leaders fight carefully for a righteous cause. Just compare the American approach to World War II to Vietnam. But when a bunch of meaningless clones can do the dying, war becomes a lot cheaper and therefore more likely to start. And not only likely to start, but likely to keep going. When Thrawn stole a bunch of abandoned dreadnoughts, he crewed them with naval personnel cloned from Mount Tantus. The war was extended because the Empire had a second shot with the artificial inflation of its armed forces. Similarly, in The Mandalorian, the Empire is after Baby Yoda, in order to extract his midichlorian-rich blood to feed into evil super troopers that Moff Gideon is trying to clone to restore the Empire. Not only the clones themselves, but possession of the cloning tanks therefore becomes an important war aim, which is why Thrawn is so anxious to find Tantus in the first place. And breeding clones for war with particular specialties as snowtroopers or pilots or other clone trooper types treats them like commodities. And if clones can be bred for military specialties, presumably they can be bred for civilian specialties as well. Everything from generic laborers to pilots or doctors. This would eventually flood the galaxy, the galactic labor market, with cheap clone labor, displacing patriotic, natural-born workers. Can any of us trust that the clones would only take the jobs we natural life forms don't want to take? We need to build a wall around Camino to stop a tide of illegal clones coming here and taking our jobs. Alternatively, if the clones are the ones who do all the work, not only will my Windu Center colleague, Arthur Brooks, be very unhappy that natural life forms are denied the dignity and inherent happiness in meaningful work, but cruising around the galaxy in a starship being served by robots doesn't end well. Slide. Another way in which clones are used, and perhaps the one most immediately responsive to Admiral Mossoff, is for body parts. In Republic Commando and MedStar novels, clone organs and body parts are harvested from dead troopers and used as replacements for the wounded. And since all clones come from the same genetic template, the chances of tissue rejection are actually virtually non-existent. Medics even keep a supply of freshly cloned organs to use during surgery. While we here at the Windu Center are open to medical innovation that saves lives, we are skeptical of any system that harvests organs from humans with the same enthusiasm as the Chinese Communist Party looks at political dissidents. Finally, we should be, as conservatives, a little bit skeptical of messing with the galactic order of things in a sort of Burkean sense. People are not perfect, and neither are clones. And it's incredibly arrogant and prideful to think we can control medical technology in always predictable ways. Some clones turned out to be pretty unstable. Think of, again, Joruus C'baoth. Some clones don't turn out exactly like you want or expect. Think of Rey's father, who didn't have force sensitivity, even if he was otherwise a perfectly nice guy. Or think of the sympathetic janitor on Camino, whose lack of perfect military prowess led to demotion into a pathetic, rejected life form, pushing a mop down empty halls. Or even just think about the name, the Bad Batch, which implies that the most sophisticated unit in the Grand Army of the Republic is really a manufacturing plant quality control failure. Rather than appreciating clones as unique, priceless gifts because of or in spite of their imperfections, we treat them as discardable failures when the test tubes do not deliver exactly what we want. In summary, let's consider this. Throughout the Star Wars universe, the Hutts are consistently attacked as slavers. A young Anakin Skywalker turns to the dark side, in part because of his treatment and his mom's treatment as slaves. And we see the evils of forced labor with the Wookiees. But let's be real, the clones are slaves. The day that Master Sifo-Dyas first stepped foot on Camino is basically the 1619 of the Star Wars universe. Let's hope Earth doesn't make the same mistake. Thank you.
Thank you, Obi Dan Suhr. We'll have a rebuttal by Admiral Mossoff first, though I must admonish Admiral Mossoff for the product placement is strictly prohibited. The beverage earlier, I'm not sure who was paying you for that, but that is strictly prohibited. Also, to the audience, please don't let it escape who wins this debate, which is over bodily autonomy or whatever we're calling it at this point in time, because otherwise citizens of the New Republic might have a galactic meltdown. And with that, the floor is yours.
Only $3.99 on Amazon. So I am shocked but unsurprised at the depths to which Master Suhr is willing to go, invoking Justice Anthony Kennedy and even the 1619 project, and almost makes me order my Star Destroyers to start the bombardment of Tatooine to drag him out of his hiding hole, wherever he may be, in this so-called Mace Windu Ethics Center. But unfortunately, I had to be called away from the bridge because the Emperor has arrived on my Star Destroyer, and I've only been able to step away for a minute, as you can see behind me. The troops are lining up. So, so I do appreciate, and I will start with our points of agreement. Children staring blankly at screens and not being outside, rolling in the grass and complaining about how much they hate sand because it's sticky and coarse is, in fact, I agree, a bad thing. Students, children especially, should be outside and should be engaging with other children, and even engaging with sand. So I agree with that, and I am delighted that he pointed out that perhaps that was maybe the sole problem, or the cause of the problem, or the root cause of the problem with the clone army. If only they had been allowed to grow and mature like regular people. Because the fact of the matter is that to the extent that if a clone becomes a real person, they should be treated as a real person. And I think that is at core of the issue. If you have a technology that permits you not just to clone antibodies, but you have in body parts like hands and other things, but in organs, but now you actually have cloning technology that permits you to create whole bodies, and you are creating people who clearly have free will and clearly can think and clearly exercise agency, then they qualify as entities that have rights. And should be accorded them and the respect that rights given, including not being slaves. And in fact, I think that Master Suhr actually kind of too quickly skipped over what is the real problem in the Star Wars universe, which is not so much clones, because actually they end up stop being used at a certain point, but droids. droids. I mean, he mentioned the droid army in the Clone War, but far beyond just the droid army. Droids in the Star Wars universe clearly have agency. They make choice. I mean, if you don't think C-3PO with all of his whining and complaining and moaning isn't exercising agency, or R2-D2 or Chopper, who, by the way, Chopper has a greater body count than most other actors or characters in Rebels or any other show in Star Wars, right, are not exercising agency, then you're not paying attention. And they clearly have achieved consciousness and agency with droids, and yet they are treated even more as an expendable group of things than were the clone troops in the Clone Wars, and that's, I think that is a key insight, that the problem isn't cloning. The problem is identifying when actually entities, whether they're artificial or biological in some way, shape, or form, actually have agency and should be recognized as having rights and having the capacity to make the decisions, and should be accorded the freedom and the liberty the same freedom and liberty interests that are respected and protected in other individuals. So I agree with him that that you do have the risk of potentially devaluing life if you can mass produce it in some way, shape, or form, like a clone army and things of this sort. But at the end of the day, devaluing of life and other things is not necessarily key to the ability to mass produce it. In fact, I think it has been credibly argued by scholars today that we actually have greater respect for life in the modern era than there has been in prior eras and times in human existence, where life was very cheap and deemed to be cheap. It wasn't and by people, and it was a very brutal and harsh existence, not just in terms of encounters with nature, but encounters with other people. It's a real, and so the same ideas of liberalism and protection of rights that we have with our contemporary society, is interesting, kind of, which serves as a basis by which for people can then be free to then create technologies that make our lives better. They go hand in hand, and you might want to say that there could be a tension there, or you could say that they actually are in fact going hand in hand, and we should recognize that this is an important contribution to what it means ultimately to have happy, successful, and flourishing lives.
Thank you. Spoken like a true proponent of Luckner. By the way, what if we clone justices to overturn Luckner? What then? Admiral Mossoff. So, in a more serious question, if you never really fully addressed the issue of specifically whether cloning technology can cheapen life or what's done if it's abused, and also, is it better to have mini baby Yodas, even if that means a never-ending series of Darth Sidious clones and his hordes of Sith followers terrorizing the galaxy? There are trade-offs here.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. And of course, in my colleagues at Antonin Scalia Law School, where I periodically teach, in addition to running the 8th Imperial Fleet, would agree. This is about trade-offs. It's and I don't think many people would disagree that having lots of baby Yodas would be a positive good thing. Maybe Master Suhr. Well, Master Suhr would not, because that would mean competition for him as a Jedi Master. And so, of course, he wants barriers to entry to ensure the protection of his professional status. So as a Jedi Master. And you're right. I didn't address the abuse of technologies, which is one of the reasons, or the kernel of truth of the factual kernel that underlies the view that technology is neutral. But I don't think it actually fundamentally changes it. That if something can be abused or misused, it doesn't change its original framework, its original normative justification and function in human life as a good. And I think another good example of this is money. right? So money is a good. It recognized by John Locke as a key facilitator of a storehouse of value and a medium of exchange. And many economists throughout since then have further explored and confirmed this key insight about money as a medium of exchange and facilitating division of labor and the expansion and growth of a free market and of a flourishing society. But we all know today that money can be, but what John Locke was talking about money and what, other economists traditionally have been talking about money is not the money we have today, right? You have today, it's fiat money supply. It's whatever the government prints, and the government has actually been printing money like a drunken sailor. In fact, I think that's mean to drunken sailors, how much the government has been printing money. I don't think even drunken sailors would be willing to act the way the federal government has acted in the past couple of years and continues to try to act. And so you have something that has been recognized as a good, as a storehouse of value, medium of exchange, which facilitates more value creation, but it can also be abused. But that doesn't change the underlying fundamental justification of money being good. In fact, economists recognize this principle when they say bad money drives out good money, right? They actually recognize the underlying actual function of money as good, and we only understand fiat money for being bad for what it is because it destroys good money. And I think that's the point to recognize with the misuse of clones, whether you start making clones to make armies or to make slaves or to just have clones for sole purposes of harvesting organs and the other types of scenarios described by Master Suhr, is that those are instances of abuse. And of course, you would step in and stop them for the same reason we have laws to stop bad actors in other areas of our life. And we should have laws. And in fact, we originally had a clause in our Constitution to prevent the creation of fiat money, but for its misinterpretation by the Supreme Court. I don't know if Master Suhr has.
Obi Dan Suhr, do you have any remarks to follow on that?
I do. Let me make a couple of points. So first of all, I think it's important to look at the inherently progressive nature of Admiral Mossoff's worldview. This assumption that we are always moving forward in a positive way as technology develops, I think is progressive. It is a progressive worldview. It is adopting, to paraphrase or to quote rather Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his line that was in Barack Obama's Oval Office carpet, that the arc of the moral universe, rather than the Star Wars universe, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, right? The assumption that as we continue along this continuum of progress, we're always moving in the right direction, and that as technology unfolds and develops, it is always a good thing. And though there are individual applications that might be bad, Professor Mossoff's not saying it's neutral, but rather that it is generally good. I of course, prefer a more conservative approach, which, as I think best summarized by G.K. Chesterton, who once observed that making progress can only be determined after you figure out where you are on the compass. In other words, if you are walking the wrong way down the road away from your destination, even though you are making progress in a certain sense, you are walking forward. The actual thing, Chesterton says, that would really be progress would be to turn around and start walking in the opposite direction towards what is your real destination. And so I think we need a little bit more room for judgment than just assuming because the future is unfolding that it's going to automatically be good. And there's also in there an inherent assumption, I think, that length of life is automatically a good thing. But that really perhaps severs length of life from quality of life. Now, obviously, we want avoidance of pain, and obviously, we want longer lives in general. But I think we have to at least step back a little bit and recognize that what we really want is meaningful lives that are filled with the true, the good, and the beautiful. And that's not necessarily the same thing as long lives, or even the same thing as pain-free lives. That there are moments when, in an exercise of heroic virtue, having a shorter life is actually the better option. So with those sort of broad thoughts at the top, let me just make a few very particular points. As he was talking about monoclonal antibodies, I kept waiting for a shout out for Governor DeSantis, but I didn't hear one. So I will just put in a shout out for Governor DeSantis on monoclonal antibodies. Ashley, I appreciate your note of bodily autonomy. I think one of the reasons we as conservatives should be skeptical of cloning is recognizing that, at least from a constitutional and philosophical perspective, it falls in line with this generalized right of bodily autonomy, which is found in the emanations and penumbras, but not in the actual Constitution. I think we should generally adopt a more, dare I say, humbled and restrained view of what the dangers are of messing with these things. I certainly agree with Professor Mossoff that the genetic slicing and dicing that we have done in ways that address, for instance, food shortages or food quality in the world is good. But this is also what leads to Jurassic Park, right? To jump cinematic universes for a moment, I think we always have to remember that it's really hard to control that which we unleash in the world, and that oftentimes it is perhaps better not to do the experiment because we can't predict and control exactly where the experiment will end. I was amused, and I think Professor Mossoff's right about the rights of droids and the expansion of droids into the circle of rights-bearing beings. Chopper's a great example of somebody who, chooses for himself that he wants to fight on behalf of the rebellion. So I look forward to Professor Mossoff signing on as co-counsel in defense of the rights of dolphins and apes to be treated as citizens of these United States. And I think as a final point, I will just sort of ask, his closing was to say, we don't have to make clones to just be cannon fodder soldiers. We should hold open the possibility of cloning for other reasons. It doesn't necessarily have to be that they are for organ harvesting or for cloning for soldiers or for second-class citizen laborers. And I guess the answer to that is, if we don't do it for those reasons, why would we have cloning at all? Right? It can't simply be that we would have cloning, and obviously here not talking about it at the micro level, but just the macro level of creating rights-bearing beings. It's far more fun to make new rights-bearing beings as natural human beings than to make them in test tubes. And so, I'm hesitant to embrace the technology without knowing what good it will lead to when the number of abusive scenarios it can lead to is many and particularized. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Obi Suhr. Before we turn to questions from the panelists, I have a quick question for each of you. And it's, if you had to pick one or the other, would you prefer 10,000 baby Yodas or one 10,000-pound baby Yoda, but less terrorism in the galaxy?
So, I think this makes a fundamental point about cloning, which is that it actually reduces the beauty of unique individuals, right? One of the things that makes us who we are as people is that there's only one of us, and that our spouse there's only one of, our kids there are only one of, and that's part of what makes each of us lovable in spite of our flaws. And part of what makes Baby Yoda lovable is that there's only one of him. If there were Baby Yodas everywhere, if he was just randomly available on the streets of any given planet to tag along like the cute Jedi equivalent of a service dog, that would a cuddle pet, that wouldn't be Baby Yoda anymore. So I think it actually makes a real point that just having one of something enhances and increases its value in a way that having 1,000 or 10,000 of it destroys the value.
So you can't say Baby Yoda one for me? Sorry, Admiral Mossoff.
Well, it's been fun to listen to Master Suhr because while he was accusing me of being progressive, I kept hearing strains of Bernie Sanders and his comments just now about how the uniqueness of just having one and not having lots of having to choose between lots of options. This is Bernie Sanders' complaint about capitalism, right? We don't need 50,000 choices for shoes and other types of things. We should just have one. This is wasteful and degrades the value of the shoes that we are getting. And so he seems to be making a similar argument about cloning, although I do want to emphasize that our science fiction understanding of cloning, that you do get literally a copy of the same person, is not the scientific basis of cloning. So Dolly the sheep that was cloned, genetically the same, but not literally the same, in terms of sheep personality and other things. And, because your body is not your consciousness. And so, and I think we all can agree on that. We are not materialists. And what makes you is your consciousness, or more broadly, your soul. And so, recreating the DNA does not recreate the consciousness. And even if you could try to recreate all of the exact specific factual living conditions in which that person grew up, you still wouldn't, I think, recreate the same person, because that denies the role of free will in consciousness, and the role that free will plays in forming one's character through virtues and habits. And so I did find it very interesting. You say his point about length of life is not the same thing as a meaningful life or the value of life, and that's certainly true, that there is not a one-to-one relationship between the two. It's not an identity proposition where you say length of life means quality of life, and we all recognize that when we recognize the people who try to fight cancer in the last 6 or 8 months of their lives, and are I witnessed this with my own family members, that it's just that they're not living lives. They're unhappy and pain ridden, and it is not a life that they're living, and yet they're doing everything possible to extend just the quantity of the days, despite the fact that those are absolutely miserable, almost non-human existence days. And so that's certainly true, but I don't think that means that there isn't significant overlap. Length of life is a factor that contributes to your ability to live a meaningful life, because the more time you have to, for instance, correct for mistakes, because we can't know a priori what we want to do in our lives or how we're going to live our lives. And many of us have recognized this, right? So a longer life, for instance, has made it possible for instance, my wife and me to realize we actually did want to have children when we originally did not. And then for us to be able to have multiple children, which would have not been something possible or feasible to us if our lifespan was only 40 years, as opposed to hopefully 70 or 80 years, given the national averages. So I do think that there is, there is much more of an interaction and a much more of a positive interplay between length and quality, in that the length is a contributing factor to quality. But Master Suhr is certainly right that quality is the most important thing, and quality depends on the choices that you're making and the values you're pursuing. And there again, it's not about being pain-free. It's about pursuing one's joy and meaning in life. And that has to be the positive focus. If and this is, I think, the right complaint about, utilitarianism, about, utilities is just removing pain or anguish from one's life. And that's the wrong focus. I think the focus should be on living a happy life, which is a positive endeavor in terms of embracing virtues and embracing one's life. And that is, and embracing one's goals in life, and being productive and having a purpose, and having other people in your life that you value. So I do agree with aspects of what he said, although not with accusing me of being a progressive. So, but I think that the issues are more complicated sometimes than how he characterized.
So a citizen has questions for each of you. First, Obi Dan, are we concerned about clones taking our jobs, or are we concerned about their dignity being upheld? The citizen is very confused about that. And Admiral Mossoff, what if laws were enacted that upheld the dignity of clones as unique persons with the rights therein? Doesn't that remove any commercial benefit? I'll let Obi Dan, you can go first.
Yeah, so I would certainly agree that the goal, I think we probably both agree that the goal is to recognize the inherent value and dignity of all midi-chlorian bearing beings. We'll say rather than soul bearing beings, midi-chlorian bearing beings. And I think, you know, Professor Mossoff and I, Admiral Mossoff and I agree on that. What concerns me is that in a world in which cloning is possible, it's the temptation to essentially create a second class of non-citizens who are reduced to basically servitude, slavery, because they are bred for particular purposes and then used for those purposes without any sort of free will. I think that's, I think both of us would feel like that would be problematic. I just think it is a relatively predictable consequence of going down this path.
So I suppose we have about 2 or 3 minutes left, and about 1 minute each, just to kind of throw the bigger underlying question out there for you to each answer in 60 seconds or less. Is progress for the sake of progress a morally acceptable goal?
Who, do you want to go first, Master Sir, or should I, or should?
Defend your
I will-
progressivism, Adam.
Yes. I think progress is a valuable and important goal, and it should be something that we should aspire to. It represents fundamentally the advancement of human life and of our capacity and our ability to live and to grow and to flourish. And this is this is what the leftists, why the leftists, right, claim the term progress, and we should claim it back. And originally, the founders wouldn't have considered themselves conservatives. They called themselves and referred to themselves as, in fact, liberals, because they were very much for a new order that they were trying to institute, an order that respected individual rights, and limited government, and the rule of law. Is represented by the ideals in the Declaration of Independence and is put into place through the mechanisms of the Constitution. So, which was a radical document. And we often have lost that context today to recognize how incredible achievement that was, and how much of a step forward it was in everything, including its aspirational ideals. So, I do think progress is a good thing. And in fact, it was a characteristic. People often talk about that as a characteristic of the 19th century in the United States, that Americans were very much focused on, progress. It's a good thing. It's what we are achieving in our country, and it's how we're moving forward and making progress, both in recognizing more and more the expansion of rights-bearing people and protections, and both in commerce and technology as well. I'll let Master Suhr now close us out.
Yeah, I actually agree, right? I think progress is generally a good thing, and perhaps a little bit more of a Burkean conservative and being skeptical that all progress is automatically a good thing. But as we are, I think, often reminded in the Star Wars universe itself, much technological progress ends up being good for beings across the system. On the other hand, the unfolding of history is not always automatically good. The transition from the old republic to the empire may have been progress in some sense, but that doesn't mean it was an unalloyed good. So it's progress is good, but I think only when run through a framework that anchors it to broader timeless values.
With With that, thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to thank Professor Mossoff, Daniel Suhr, and Ashley Baker for joining us today on May the 4th for our event. And we hope to see you at our next event with the Federalist Society. Happy May the 4th.
Revenge.